The campaign cycle for the 2016 general election in the United States has been characterized by some throwbacks to the 1980s, most notably in the two major party challengers, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Most remarkably, the Sanders campaign has introduced the word socialism into mainstream political discourse. It's clear that what socialism means in Sanders' mouth, however, is New Deal liberalism, despite the poster of Eugene Debs that hangs in Sanders' Senate office. The specter of socialism is just that, the meaning it has for Obama's Tea Party opponents. As Marx wrote over 150 years ago, quote, "Every demand of the simplest bourgeois financial reform, of the most ordinary liberalism, of the most formal republicanism, of the most insipid democracy, is simultaneously castigated as an attempt on society and stigmatized as socialism." Just because Sanders embraces, instead of rejecting, the pejorative hurled at any and all proposed reforms of capitalism, doesn't make the charge any more true in fact. For Sanders, it is a mere ethic, but it appeals nonetheless. Sanders' candidacy seems to fulfill the demands born of the post-2008 economic crisis and downturn, the discontents with neoliberalism, itself an artifact of the post-1973 crisis that was met by the 1980s Reagan Revolution, and to offer the electoral vehicle for the Occupy Wall Street generation of activists disenchanted by Obama and the Democrats after 2012. The Occupy generation's wielding of the corpse of social democracy and getting behind Sanders as the standard-bearer for reform recalls the 1980s film Weekend at Bernie's, in which the protagonists in the movie hide behind the eponymous man's body as an excuse for wild adventure, in this case, a hardly naive adolescent misadventure with the Democrats. It is regressive. In a dynamic reminiscent of Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns of the 1980s, Sanders has offered left opposition to Democratic Party centrism, but not by opposing, but trying to capture it as well. Sanders' meeting with Killer Mike isn't the answer. Mike already had endorsed him back in June. Sanders' campaign from its inception in May has been surprisingly and increasingly successful, but it has since plateaued. For a moment in September, it looked like Hillary Clinton's presidential candidacy was in jeopardy due to the Benghazi hearings. Even Obama threw the Democrats' favorite under the bus, acknowledging in an interview on 60 Minutes of October 11th that Clinton had mishandled her email communication as Secretary of State. In the same interview, Obama asserted that he would win a third election, and, much the same thing, that Biden's experience as vice president eminently qualified him to be president. But Hillary survived Benghazi, and Biden bowed out. The Democrats, since the 2014 midterm elections, in which they failed to dislodge the Republicans' congressional majority, have been faced with the problem of reproducing the Obama majority that was victorious in 2008 and 2012. This has been described as the challenge of uniting the Democrats' left and center voters. The left is organized labor and others concerned with socioeconomic issues. The center, really the right, are those concerned with identity group politics, women, blacks, and gays. This potentially fatal split among the Democrats was seen in the 2015 Chicago citywide election, in which Obama's former chief of staff, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, was challenged by fellow Democrat Cook County Commissioner Jesus Chuy Garcia, who had the support of the Chicago Teachers Union that had struck against Emanuel and his neoliberal educational reforms in 2012, seeking to embarrass the Chicago native Obama precisely during his campaign for re-election. In the 2015 Chicago mayoral election, black Democrats supported Rahm against Chuy. This was not merely a division between blacks and Latinos, but rather a split of and within the Democrats' organized labor base from its ethnic constituency community-based neoliberal politics. The former 1960s Black Panther, United States Congressional Representative Bobby Rush, for instance, denounced Chewy's campaign for trying to usurp the mantle of the first black mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington, majority, as against the prior Daley political machine that first emerged in the 1980s, which Rush implied could only be reproduced, if at all, by black and not Latino leadership. That is, a neoliberal center-right majority, and not a labor-based politics. Washington was supported by the left. His campaign chief was a former Maoist. Shades of Van Jones? For Rush and other black Democrats in Chicago, Rahm is the Washington majority candidate, as Obama was and Hillary will be. Chewy's challenge to Rahm has actually provided Emanuel with the opportunity for achieving the electoral mandate endorsement he previously lacked. Now, a majority has voted in favor of his neoliberal policies. Far from a crisis for neoliberalism, neoliberalism has been further consolidated against any contenders. This is a lesson for Sanders supporters. When Hillary is elected by primary voters as the Democratic Party candidate for president, they will have chosen and given a mandate to neoliberalism. Hillary's ability to unite the left and right of the Democrats is uncertain. If she can do so, still, she will not be able to generate the same level of enthusiasm that Obama did in 2008. Certainly, this goes for labor. Obama's 2008 campaign, for instance, offered organized labor the prospect of passing the Employee Free Choice Act under a Democratic majority, but was unceremoniously dropped after the election. Obama's campaign demanded, and achieved, a reuniting of labor in the AFL-CIO from its split in the Change to Win Federation, so that they would have to negotiate with only one rather than multiple labor constituencies. Obama sought to bring labor under control, specifically in the context of the potentially explosive 2008 economic crisis. The Democrats did not face a labor insurgency. Neither will they now. Into this bitter legacy steps Sanders, whose call for political revolution he explicitly described as an electoral strategy for raising turnout, especially among younger, newer voters, and thus returning the Democrats to a congressional majority that they enjoyed when Obama was elected until the 2010 Tea Party congressional election insurgency. Sanders has offered himself as a better champion for the Democrats in the 2016 general election than Hillary can be. The problem has been on the Democratic right. Sanders' alleged problem with women and blacks. Hillary has supposedly maintained appeal to the social identity constituencies, despite some turbulence from Black Lives Matter and the memory by gays that both Clintons have had a poor record on marriage equality. The presumptive character of Hillary's nomination, especially as a woman candidate, has exhibited a complacency that chafes, and is not guaranteed to pay off in terms of voter mobilization. The degree to which the left has gotten on board with Sanders, it has been in the form of the alleged brocialists, straight white men. Socialism has meant a backlash against identity politics, an attempt to return to the Democrats' historic role as economic reformers going back to FDR's New Deal and LBJ's Great Society, which had pressured the Republicans such that even Eisenhower and Nixon were purportedly to the left of the Clintons on economic policy. There is also the sense that in the post-2008 environment, Sanders could appeal to and win back an older generation of disaffected voters, the so-called Reagan Democrats, whose shifting allegiances allowed the Republicans to triumph since the 80s. Now approaching retirement age and concerned about the opportunities for their children and grandchildren bequeathed by 30 years of decrepit neoliberalism. Sanders thus offers the Democrats an answer to the Tea Party that has been sorely lacking since 2010, as expressed by the frustration that bubbled over in the 2011 Occupy Wall Street protests. A new generation of activists was mobilized to get the money out of politics, especially in opposition to the 2010 U.S. Supreme Court Citizens United decision that allows unlimited campaign spending, a generation whose concerns about social justice and the erosion of democracy Sanders speaks to. The question has been whether the Sanders campaign is for real, or whether, rather, it is merely a protest pressure tactic on Hillary, slowing and perhaps redirecting, however slightly, the Clinton juggernaut. Sanders' claim that higher turnout means electoral gains for the Democrats neglects that not only the Republicans, but they themselves engage in and benefit from voter suppression, especially among blacks, especially in the Democrats' urban strongholds. The Democrats have no interest in popular political mobilization, even behind the most anodyne and unthreatening symbolic gestures, see Black Lives Matter, and so seek to curtail it. Not least, this is because the Democrats don't want the political responsibility that would come with large majorities, as was clear in 2008 to 2010, in which they bent their congressional supermajority over backwards to placate the utterly prostrate Republicans. Any substantial increase in the voting electorate would present problems of political integration. See the Tea Party's challenge to the Republican establishment, which would really rather do without such berserkers in their midst. Even before the Tea Parties, in the 2008 bailout crisis, it was unclear whether congressional Republicans were to fall victim to their own neoliberal rhetoric instead of taking required action to prevent a complete financial meltdown. International financial markets constantly worry over the political paralysis in the U.S., yielded by the Republicans hostage to the Tea Party congressmen, and the implications of this for the world economy. The Democrats would be challenged by such unruly voters, especially at the local level of municipal and state governments, as in Illinois, at least as much, if not more so, than the Republicans are. Neoliberalism needs to be seen as both an accommodation to and a reinforcement of social and political demobilization since the 1960s, visible, for instance, in the decimation of labor unions, but also of other civil society institutions, after abandonment of their original liberal raison d'etre, in favor of integration in what the Frankfurt School called the authoritarian administered state, already observable to C. Wright Mills and other political scientists after the waning of the radicalization of the 1930s through World War II. What remained was the political party's organization of a power elite, but even this structure has atrophied since the 1960s. Privatization through NGOs has not meant a renaissance of civil society, but has left the political field abandoned of any substantial forces for reform since the 1980s. Even what Eisenhower decried as the military-industrial complex in the Cold War has been revealed after the Iraq War as a massively corrupt freewheeling affair, and not a political force to be reckoned with. Enormous sums of money may be thrown around to government contractors, but this hardly amounts to political control over policy. 1970s Ford administration veteran Donald Rumsfeld went to war not only against foes in Afghanistan and Iraq, but against the Pentagon itself in a neoliberal privatization campaign of slimming down the military, to the embitterment of the officer corps, even amid soaring expenditures. What C. Wright Mills warned about political responsibility in liberal rhetoric and conservative default has only grown more unchecked since the 60s. Indeed, Mills seems too optimistic in light of even more miserable realities today. The political establishment is actually quite threadbare and in evident disarray, not a convincing power elite. But there is no alternative. The issue is whether the post-2008 crisis has been an opportunity for undoing neoliberalism, reversing the 80s, or for further entrenching it. But to overcome neoliberalism, there would need to be an organized political force for doing so. The Democrats are decidedly not this in any conceivable way. The crisis in Europe has demonstrated an opportunity for expanding and deepening neoliberalism, and not for returning to social democracy, despite Syriza, Podemos, and Jeremy Corbyn's resting seasoned 1980s Benite leadership of the United Kingdom's Labour Party back away from the third way spectacularly unconvincing 1990s offspring Blairite runts. Sanders has more evident conviction than Hillary could ever exhibit. This recalls heroic opposition to Reaganism, why his followers have been affectionately nicknamed after the Sandernistas. One key issue for the Sandernistas that is also similar to the dynamic of Corbyn's supporters in the UK is the 2000s George W. Bush-era anti-war movement as touchstone. Sanders, like Corbyn, opposed the Iraq War, which makes him amenable to the left. Does the Sanders campaign represent a potential political turn, or is it the last gasp of Occupy activism before growing up and joining the fold of the Democrats? Sanders abandoning his hitherto vintage 1960s independence from the Democrats points the way for the younger generation of 21st century activists. The left may be tempted to imagine the Sanders campaign as a potential crisis for the Democrats, just as Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party could be seen as a crisis and opportunity for the left. It is more likely that, just as Corbyn will save and not wreck the Labour Party, Sanders will boost and not undermine the Democrats' campaign around Hillary in 2016, or at least that is his avowed hope. What, if any kind of political movement, could come out of the Sanders campaign? The Sandernistas certainly do not think of the campaign as a way to reconcile themselves to the Democratic Party, but rather hope to transform it. Like with Chewy in Chicago, the hope is to mobilize new forces through the campaign that will be sustained after the election. Will this be within or outside the Democratic Party? Perhaps it will be both. In the 1980s, the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, was established. In 2004, the Progressive Democrats of America was founded out of the Howard Dean and Dennis Kucinich presidential campaigns. The first was, in DSA founder Michael Harrington's words, quote, a remnant of the New Left. The second was in many respects a repeat of the first. These have not been auspicious developments indicating possibilities for where the Sandernistas might go after 2016. The DSA supported Jesse Jackson's Democratic Party campaign for president, which Sanders also endorsed in protest against Reaganism. The precedents in the 1980s legacy of the 1960s New Left suggest the further adaptation to, through protest of, the Democrats moving ever rightward. Sanders, like Trump, demonstrates the hollowness of the two U.S. political parties today, if only through the inability to stop their candidacies by the establishment. The parties are no longer the formidable machines they were in the 20th century, confronted by the 1960s New Left generation, but are merely brandings anyone can buy into, whether wholesale by billionaire magnates like Trump himself or the Koch brothers' Tea Party backers, or through tiny payments to Sanders' 2016 campaign, as had been made to Obama in 2008 as an internet media phenomenon. Clinton, at least, still needs to win over union endorsements and particular capitalist business sector funding. But in any case, there is no political process involved, but only the aestheticization of politics as a consumer article. As such, it can and will be rendered in typical postmodernist pastiche of non-partisan eclecticism. Politics means what any and everyone wants to make of it. This is even claimed as a virtue of divided government. The worst possible outcome of this is the most likely. that Hillary will be elected as president, but the Republicans will retain a congressional majority, reproducing the polarized stalemate and deadlock that actually stabilizes U.S. politics around a conservative neoliberal consensus, in which certain social issues are given obligatory genuflections without being actually addressed, let alone ameliorated. Since the Democrats won the culture wars under Obama's neoliberal leadership, a new division of labor with the Republicans has been established. That the Republicans will represent straight white men, especially in rural and ex-urban areas, and the Democrats, under the leadership of the Clintonite neoliberal center-right, will represent women, blacks, and gays in their petty bourgeois ethnic constituency urban and more urbane suburban communities. Welcome to the new normal. It began in the 80s with Reagan's presidency, under which the Democrats retained control of Congress. In the 1980s, the yuppies, young urban professionals, that is to say grown-up children of the 1960s, were regarded as new but conservative. Today, they are called hipsters and are considered liberal, as well as entirely normal. An electoral demographic spanning everyone from college to middle age, referred to in conventional polling analysis as voters under 50, i.e. the generation that came of age after the 80s. Sanders, like Trump, indicatively does best among them, where Clinton does better among those over 50. In the 1980s, identity politics consolidated the accommodation to and resolution of neoliberalism in the Reagan Revolution. What Adolph Reed has called the Jesse Jackson phenomenon exemplified this. It has continued up to the present. Through such eminently respectably conservative measures as gay marriage equality. Obama has not brought about any social changes, but only granted them legal legitimacy. But where Obama at least seemed to symbolize change, a new post-60s generation, Sanders as well as Clinton represent a return, diminished expectations. Sanders raising the specter of the old left, 1930s to 60s New Deal coalition's venerable political heritage for the Democrats, which came to grief in the 80s, will be the means not for resuscitating, but finally burying it. There will be no political revolution apart from the one already long underway since the 80s. The final decades of the 20th century were successfully seized by the same end of history to which the 21st century will yet continue to belong, evidently for a long time to come. Daniel Ortega's return to power as part of the greater Latin American pink tide in the 2000s represented the final surrender, or was it rather the ultimate triumph, of the Sandernistas, and put paid to any 80s left nostalgia on which he may have traded. The same will go for Sanders. Sanders, as an outlier 1960s remnant of the Reagan era, becomes a mainstream political phenomenon today only as a function of giving up the ghost. The 1960s were not defeated but institutionalized in the 1980s. Today, this recent historical process has been completely naturalized, the domesticated televised version of the 1960s as historical curiosity. What needs to be reconciled today, by contrast with 2008, is not the 60s but the 80s. Not the last hurrah of the former 1960s radical weather underground terrorist Bill Ayers, who helped Obama get his political start as a generational bequest 40 years after Chicago's Days of Rage, but the 1980s mayor of Burlington, Vermont, alongside the vintage 1980s New York City real estate speculator, will be the specter haunting 2016. The 1960s New Left, in which Sanders and Clinton and Corbyn took part, could not and will not give any rebirth to socialism, however defined. It could not prevent and indeed actively assisted and not merely accommodated the demise of the Great Society. Whatever regrets it may have now do not point any way forward, but only towards its retirement and a historical settling of the past. Just as Clinton's election in 1992 did not reverse Reaganite neoliberalism by pot-smoking former campaigners in 1972 for George McGovern, Sanders' late protest today may seal neoliberalism's unalloyed triumph. Margaret Thatcher claimed Tony Blair as her ultimate achievement, Sanders begging to differ from Hillary before her election as Clinton too will thus be the final victory of the 1980s.